Good evening once again, and thank you for joining us. And today we are going to embark on a journey to understand one of the most important but least talked about chapters in the Bible and also in the book of Daniel. Um, I don't know how much of Daniel you're familiar with, but Daniel chapter 2, 7, 8, and 9 contains prophecies pertaining to the last days, and those are very widely talked about. But Daniel 11 contains one of the most comprehensive prophecy in this book, and for this reason, and we will divide this into two presentations to cover as many details as possible. Today we'll be looking at chapter 11, verses 1 through 22, and tomorrow we will continue from verses 23 to uh, verse 45, pardon me. So let's pray and begin. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, God, as we uh, embark on this journey, as we start this journey to understand Daniel chapter 11, and Father, for the truths and the messages that you have revealed for us, I pray, Father, that your Holy Spirit, who inspired the authors to write these words, would be with us here, and that your Holy Spirit would speak through me and help everyone who listens to understand. God, I pray that this message would not just be another message for the mind, but also for the heart. I pray, God, that we would humbly listen to your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. There are a couple of things that I want to briefly touch on as we seek to understand this chapter. While I was working, it was last week, while I was working, there was this person who asked a question. One of my job description is to answer the Bible questions that we get, and so this person watched one of our prophecy videos, and he asked this. You say this is a prophecy video, but why is this preacher talking a lot of history? Why is he talking a lot of history? And so it is very important for us to understand what prophecy is. You see, prophecy doesn't talk about some events that are going to take place in Mars or in a totally different dimension than us. No, prophecy talks about you and me. It talks about this earth and the events that are going to happen on this earth. Dictionary defines prophecy as foretelling or prediction of what is to come. You see, God does not predetermine that these are the events that are going to happen. On the contrary, God, He foresees what events would happen and He tells it ahead. Prophecy is history predicted, and history is prophecy fulfilled. Prophecy is history predicted, and history is prophecy fulfilled. So, whenever we study the prophetic books of the Bible, there is an intersection between history and prophecy and the events that are going to take place. And so, this is why we study this chapter. When we study this chapter, you will see a sequential development of history from the past going down till the coming of Jesus. So bear with me as we seek to understand centuries of history in this one presentation. And I'm going to be throwing out a lot of names, but do not worry if you cannot catch it all. I will make these notes available at the end. Another introductory remark I want to emphasize, which we have been doing, which I again want to emphasize, is this principle of repeat and enlarge. We have seen in the book of Daniel how prophecies have been repeated and then enlarged with greater detail for a better understanding. We have seen that in Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, and we will look at it in chapter 11 as well, where we will see a greater number of detail in this prophecy. In fact, I'm overall familiar with the prophecies in Daniel and Revelation, but in none of these chapters have I seen history so accurately predicted as we will see in Daniel chapter 11. And so we are again going to see this principle of repeat and enlarge being used again. And the other thing is, I want to point out the similarities between Daniel chapter 2 and 7 and Daniel 8 and 11. For example, Daniel chapter 2 and 7, it begins with Babylon, but Daniel chapter 8 and 11, it begins with Medo-Persia, as we will see. See, both Daniel chapter 2 and 7, it ends with the setting up of God's everlasting kingdom, but Daniel chapter 8 and 11, it does not have a climax. See, only Daniel and 8 and Daniel chapter 8 and verse and chapter 11 talks about the daily and the so on. And so there are many other interesting aspects that we can focus on, but the point I want to bring across is that Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 11 are very similar. In fact, one author writes that Daniel 11 is a more progressive revelation or commentary of Daniel chapter 8. And so we will study this. We will look at this over today and tomorrow. And so now let's begin our study of Daniel chapter 11. But before we begin, what is the purpose that God gives this vision to Daniel? It is very, very important for us to keep this in mind, because that is how we are going to make the application. What is the purpose of God in giving this vision to Daniel? If you go to Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14, Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14. The last time we met, John took us over Daniel chapter 14. We saw this battle between the prince of Persia, between Michael and Daniel, and so on. And Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, it begins by saying that Daniel understood the 2300-day prophecy because the angel helped him understand in Daniel chapter 9. And but in verse 14, the angel comes and he tells to Daniel something. Angel Gabriel, he comes and he tells to Daniel something. What does he say? Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14, it says, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days." What is the purpose of this vision? The purpose of this vision is for Daniel to understand what will befall or what will happen to his people in the latter days. Who are his people? What are the latter days? We will look at this at the end and tomorrow. Now let's go get into our subject matter. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 1. It says, "And I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." So this is Gabriel talking, and he says during the first year of Darius the Mede, which was 539 BC, he was confirming and strengthening this King Darius. This may explain why Darius was favorable to Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. But this vision that we are going to see was given during the third year of Cyrus, which we will see. And so let's read Daniel chapter 11 and verse 2. It says, "And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet three kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they are." See, Gabriel is talking from the vantage point of the Medes and the Persians co-ruling. And from that time, he says, three kings shall stand up in Persia, and the fourth shall be richer than the previous three. Now, this vision was given at the third year of Cyrus, according to chapter 10 and verse 1. Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, it says, "In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel." So you see, this vision that is recorded in Daniel chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12, it was given to Daniel in the third year of Cyrus, which was 536 535 BC. So who were these three kings that followed Cyrus the Great? Because the verse tells us that after you, from this point, there will be three other kings who will come up in Persia, and the fourth one will be far richer than they all. So who were these three kings that followed Cyrus? It was Cambyses. He ruled from 529 to 521 BC, about 7.5 years. And the next king who followed him was False Murdis, and he ruled for just 5 months. And then Darius Hystaspes, he ruled for 31 years, from 521 BC to 486 BC. These were the three kings that followed Cyrus. But then the verse tells us that There the fourth shall be far richer than they all. Who is this fourth king? It's Xerxes. In the Bible, he is known as Ahasuerus, and he was the one who actually married Esther, and he ruled from 485 to 464 BC, which was about 21 years, and he was the richest after Cyrus. This verse continues by saying, and by his strength and through his riches he shall stir up all again against the realms of Grecia. In one historian, one author, he writes, this king, he spent 4 years stockpiling supplies and assembling manpower for a military expedition against Greece, just as the angel had predicted. In fact, he organized a mighty army, which historian Herodotus he numbers has 5,200,000 men from over 40 countries who were his allies, or 52 lakh people. They came together to fight as allies from over 40 countries to side with this king Ahasuerus. And all of these men, they travel all the way from their homelands to the battle of Salamis in 480 and Plataea in 479 in Greece, but they all lost the battle. And so after Xerxes, there were 13 other minor kings, but none of them were able to fight and overcome Greece. And so when the prophecy tells us that he stirred up all his realms against the kingdom of Grecia, that was true. The Bible predicted this centuries ago and it was fulfilled. Now let's read verse 3 and 4. It says, and a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Who is this mighty king? This king, it says, he will rule with great dominion and he will do according to his will. And when you read verse 4, which we will in a bit, it tells us that his kingdom was broken and divided towards the four winds of heaven, the four corners, east, west, north, and south. Who is this king? Does it ring a bell to you? There was this king who was mighty, who will stand up. He will rule with great dominion, and then his kingdom being divided into four divisions. Does it ring a bell to you? This doubtless refers to Alexander the Great. In Daniel chapter 8, we saw the same pattern. The he goat with the notable horn conquers the ram with the two horns, and afterwards this notable horn was broken up, and then four notable horns came up according to the winds of heaven, which again represents Alexander the Great. He rose up, and after ruling with great dominion, he was broken down, and then four other horns came up. His kingdom was divided into four other things. And so we have already seen about the conquest of Alexander the Great, and he truly ruled with great dominion, and we don't have to go over all of that. But let's go to verse 4. It says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. And so while he was at the height of his power, Alexander, he died, and his kingdom was broken. When Alexander died, he was left with a brain damaged half brother and an infant son, both of them not capable to rule this mighty empire. And so, on his deathbed, when he was asked who would rule after him, Alexander said, to the strongest. That is, among his four generals, whoever is the strongest, they were the ones who are going to rule his kingdom. That was Alexander's reply. And sure enough, less than 25 years of internal struggle between his leading generals, in 301 BC, his empire was sliced up four ways. Cassander took the west, Lysimachus took the north, Seleucus took the east, and Ptolemy took the south. And so, just as the Bible predicted, his kingdom was not for his posterity. You see, as time went on, Lysimachus he conquered Cassander. So, and then Seleucus conquers Lysimachus, and so now Seleucus he owns or he rules the north, east, and western part of the kingdom, and so he becomes the king of the south, and his capital was in Syria. And Ptolemy in became the was the king of the south, and his capital was Egypt. And so exactly what happened to kingdom of Greece was that it was divided. And so at this point it is vital to note the distinction of the king of the north and the king of the south. And because as we will read later, it will talk a lot about king of the north and king of the south. Who were these kings? All the king of the north were from the Seleucus dynasty, and all the king of the south were from Ptolemy. And so now, how did this distinction come, king of the north and king of the south? It is actually based on the land of Palestine. It was in relation to Palestine that the king of the north and the king of the south was delineated. And so all the king of the south are called Ptolemy, while the king of the north are either called Antiochus or Seleucus. And so now, from verses 5 through 14, it talks about this internal warfare between the Grecian Empire, which we will study. Verse 5, it talks about the first Syrian war. It says, "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his prince, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion." And so here we have the first Syrian war. It says, so now, who is the king of the south who is strong? This refers to Ptolemy the Soter, who was strong. He was the king of south, Ptolemy. And this verse tells us that one of his prince shall be strong, and he shall have dominion over the king of the south. Who is this one prince who was with Ptolemy, who then became strong above Ptolemy? Seleucus. You see, Seleucus was one of the prince of Ptolemy when he was thrown out of Babylon. But by gaining help of Ptolemy, he became strong, and after a certain point, he became stronger than Ptolemy, controlling three-fourths of Alexander's kingdom. He controlled the north, west, and eastern divisions of his kingdom, while Ptolemy was left only with the southern part of his kingdom. And verse 6, it talks about the second Syrian war, and it says, "And in the end of years they shall join themselves together." And so after many years of battle, they thought that they could come up with a solution to end the battles. What was the solution? "For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement." Verse 6. And so through marriage alliance they sought peace. This event that is talked about here is 35 years after the death of Seleucus. In 249 BC, this political alliance was formed. Seleucus' grandson Antiochus II, Theos, he divorced his wife Laodice in order to marry the daughter of Ptolemy to Philadelphus. Her name was Bernice. And so Ptolemy gave his daughter Bernice with immense dowry to Antiochus Theos upon the condition that he divorces his wife Laodice. And this marriage was purely for political convenience. But the verse continues, "But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that beget her, and he that strengthened her in these times." You see, but this union, it did not stand. When Ptolemy II Philadelphus died, Antiochus Theos, who married Ptolemy's daughter Bernice, took his former wife Laodice again. But Laodice was filled with rage, and so she poisons Antiochus, and she makes arrangement for the murder of Bernice, her son, and her son with Antiochus and her attendants from Egypt, and they were all killed. This happened in second century BC, but the prophecy predicted this in 600 BC or 500 BC. And so this was all predicted in prophecy. Now let's read verse 7. It says, "But out of a branch of her roots," or which is out of the branch of Bernice shall once stand up in in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, shall deal against them, and shall prevail. And so one out of the roots of Bernice one stood up. And who was this? This was Ptolemy the third, Euergetes. He was the brother of Bernice, who was murdered by Laodice and her son, who was now the king of North, Seleucus II Calonicus. And so, because his sister was murdered, Ptolemy II Euergetes, he invades the fortress of the king of the north and he prevails. So in 246 BC, he invades the king of the north, Seleucus Calonicus, and who with his mother Laodice, they were reigning in Syria. And so this king from the south, he goes to the king of the north and he prevails against them. He takes revenge because his sister was murdered by this king and her mother. And so he goes and he conquers Syria and Sicilia and even the upper parts beyond the Euphrates and eastward toward Babylon. And verse 8 and 9 it says, and he shall carry captives into Egypt their gods, with the prince and with the prince with the princess, with the prince and with the precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. And so here it is in this verse where we clearly see that the king of the south, it represents Egypt. It names it in verse 8. It says, and shall carry captives into Egypt, their gods. And so this verse is very key because it identifies Egypt as the king of the south. And so this king of south, Ptolemy the third Euergetes, he not only defeated Seleucus Calonicus, but he killed his mother Laodice, and he recovered 40,000 talents of silver and precious vessels and 2,500 images of Egyptian gods, which were stolen years earlier by Cambyses, a Persian king. And so Ptolemy the third, he invaded the territory of the king of the north, but he returned to Egypt voluntarily. And so this king Euergetes, the king of the south, he continued more years than the king of the north. He lived 4 to 5 years longer than Seleucus Calonicus, who died from a fall from his horse while he was in exile. And so, just as prophecy predicted, everything came to fulfillment. Now we are in verse 10. Verse 10, it says, but his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Who are the sons? This refers to the sons of Seleucus the third Calonicus. He died, remember, he died in exile while he fell from his horse, but his sons now came up and they wanted to take revenge against the king of the south. And so it was Seleucus the third, Serranus, and Antiochus the third, Magnus. These were the sons of Seleucus the third, Calonicus. And so, but shortly after his reign, Seleucus the third, Serranus, was assassinated, and his brother Antiochus the third, Magnus, he ruled after him, and he successfully regained all the lands that were conquered by Ptolemy Euergetes. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. He even goes to Egypt, but he does not destroy, but makes a truce, and he returns home. And verse 11 says, and the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. In response to this, the king of the south, he was moved with choler or bitterness, and he comes to uh, he comes with high rage to battle against this king of the north. And so, who is this king of the north, south now? It is Ptolemy the fourth, Philopator, the son of Ptolemy III Euergetes. And so who is king of the north? It is Antiochus III Magnus. And so he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand, verse 11 reads. And so this is talking about the battle of Raphaea in 217 BC. Antiochus the third Magnus, he comes with this great multitude, a great army to battle against Ptolemy the fourth Philopator. But this great army of the king of the south was given to the king of the north. How? First, Polybius, the leading historian from this period, he states that Antiochus's army numbered 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 102 elephants, and Ptolemy's troops seem to have been about the same. And verse 12 it says, and when he had taken away the multitude, and his heart shall be lifted up, he shall cast down many thousands, but he shall not be strengthened by it. When after the first day of the battle, the body count next day revealed that Antiochus the third had lost about 10,000 of his soldiers, and 4,000 were taken as prisoners. And so just as prophecy predicted, Ptolemy losses were lighter, and Ptolemy took great multitude of Antiochus the third's army, and eventually he defeated Antiochus the third Magnus. And when he had taken away the multitude, verse 13 talks about the defeat of Antiochus the third and his armies being taken by Ptolemy the fourth Philopator. And verse 12 it says, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many thousands, many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. How was his heart lifted up? This is talking about Ptolemy, the fourth Philopator. He says his heart was lifted up. How was his heart lifted up? You see, after defeating the king of the north, this king, he did not engage in any battle. Instead, he was intemperate and indolent. Instead of conquering the king of the north completely, he made a peace agreement with Antiochus III Magnus, and he enjoyed his life with debauchery and intemperance. And his history also tells us that he took his army to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple, but he was not allowed to enter into the holy and the most holy place. Filled with rage, this king, he killed about 40,000 to 60,000 Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, as a retaliation. Thus, he lifts his heart and cast down many thousands, just as the verse predicted. And as a result, his own subjects turned against him. Because he took a war on the Jews, his kingdom began to decline, and he died when he was just 37 years old, leaving his kingdom to his infant son Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanius. Now, verse 13, Daniel chapter 11 and verse 13, this is talking about the fifth Syrian war. It says, for the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after him with great army and with much riches. For the king of the north shall return. Meanwhile, Antiochus the third, who was the king of the north, though he was defeated by Ptolemy the fourth, he engages in conquest all the way to India in the east and the Aegean in the west, making the king of the north great again. And it says, and he shall set forth great multitude than the former, and shall come after certain years with great army and with much riches. For about 16 years, this peace treaty lasts, but now to avenge for the defeat in Raphaea, this king Antiochus III, he returns to fight against the king of the south. He comes after 16 years with greater army and with a much increased chance for victory, because the king of the south was just a 5-year-old Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanius. What can a 5-year-old king do against this mighty army? And so he thought this would be a great opportunity, and so he comes to fight against the king of the south. But what does the verse say? And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Who are the many that stood up against Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes? Number one, it was king of the north Antiochus III Magnus. Though he thought it would be a good time for now for him to avenge his loss, and so he comes with his allies. The who were the many that stood up against the king of the south? The Jews who revolted against Ptolemy the fourth for killing as many as 40 to 60,000 of their people. Who were the people who stood up against the king of the south? Philip of Macedon, who entered into league with Antiochus Magnus to divide the dominion of Ptolemy the Epiphanes. He was an ally with the king of the north. And also Agathocles. He was the prime minister for the infant king Ptolemy Epiphanes, and he was very proud and he was working seditiously against the infant king, but he was killed. And so, while all of these people were rising up against Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes, what happens to him? Verse 14 it says, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Here there comes this new power. This power is called as robbers of thy people. Another translation says they were the violent ones. Now this new power will be so violent that it will come to fight against the king of the north and its allies. So this power comes to support the king of the south. And so who is this power? Who is this power that comes to help king of the south? This power refers to the pagan Roman Empire. They were the ones who helped the king of the south to fight off his rivals. They were initially unsuccessful, but later they became a great power, as we shall see. So now the battle is between the king of the north and his allies versus king of the south and Rome. And pagan Rome was in its initial stages at this point. Now let's read verse 15. It says, so the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities. Even though the Roman power defended the king of the south, beginning in 200 BC, the king of the north, Antiochus III Magnus, he overcame the initial defense and he conquered the city of Tyre, which is the most fenced city at this point. And verse 15 it continues, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. And so the Roman who had vowed to stand with Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes, they took him to Rome and they gave him education and training. But at the same time, they took one of his generals, Scopus, who was chosen by the Romans to defend the south. Although he was successful at first, he did not last. Antiochus the third Magnus, he fulfilled the prophecy by defeating Scopus. And so after him, Seleucus the fourth Philopator, he came, and after him, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, he was upset with the Jews because the Jews they sided with Rome, and so he very nearly exterminated the religion and the culture of the Jews. You know, talking about this Antiochus, history tells us that he stripped the sanctuary of all its treasures and he plundered Jerusalem and he left the city and its wall in ruins and he slew thousands of Jews and carried others into exiles as slaves. And so a royal edict commanded them to abandon all rights of their own religion and to live as a heathen. And this king, he even went to this extent to erect pagan altars in every Judean town, and he commanded the people to offer swine's flesh upon them and to surrender every copy of the scriptures to be torn and to be burned. Alexander offered swine before a pagan idol set up in Jewish temple, and his suspension of the Jewish sacrifices endangered the survival of the Jewish religion and the identity of the Jews as a people. Eventually, the Jews rose in revolt and drove the forces of Antiochus from Judea. They even succeeded in repelling an army sent by Antiochus for the specific purpose of exterminating them as a nation. Free once more from their oppressive hand, the Jews at this point, they went on and they set up a new altar, and they began offering sacrifices, and they restored their temple. And years later, they formed this alliance with pagan Rome in 161 BC, so that they can be secure. The Jews, therefore, they enjoyed nearly a century of comparative independence and prosperity under Roman protection, until Judea became part of Rome, which we will see just in later. And so verse 15, it talks about this king of the north who will come against the king of the south, and he will defeat the chosen one from the king of the south. But verse 16 says, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. So here we have this power that comes, and this power will even stand in the glorious land. What does this all talk about? You see, the Bible predicts that there will be this power that will come against the king of the north. King of the north was successful at this point because he defeated the king of the south who allied with the Rome. But it tells us that, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will. Bible predicts that there will be a power that will come against this king of the north. This power will do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand even in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. Which power opposed the king of the north? It was the Roman power, the pagan Roman Empire. At first, even though they were defeated, there were two important events that happened in 168 BC. First, they defeated the Macedonians in the Battle of Pydna, and by this victory, they defeated the king of the north, and they were ruling. And the second thing that happened in 168 BC was that they ended the power of Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. And it is a very fascinating history to read. While Rome was engaging in battle with the Macedonians, Antiochus thought it was a good opportunity for him to go and capture Egypt again. And so Antiochus, he carries his conquest into the very heart of Egypt, which again appealed to Rome for help. But before the assistance could arrive, Antiochus had conquered all of Egypt except the city of Alexandria. And so Ptolemy was helpless, and they again sent a frantic appeal to Rome, Populus Linus, to come and rescue them from Antiochus. And so as Antiochus was about to begin the siege of Alexandria, when Poppius Linus delivered to him the decree of the Roman Senate asking him to refrain from attacking the allies of the Roman Republic. And so Antiochus, he tells to this messenger saying that he would consult with his officers and he would give them a reply. But Lianus's staff, not Lianus's staff, Lianus, he took his staff, his rod, and he drew a circle in sand around Antiochus, and he demanded an answer before he left the circle. And so Antiochus, after for a few moments of hesitation, he yields to the ultimatum of this new power from the west. Antiochus was afraid of that his kingdom would fall, and so he surrenders to the Roman Empire. And this happened in 168 BC, the date of the true beginning of Rome. And it talks about this king and this power, and it says, he shall stand in the glorious land. What is the glorious land? We will look at it then. And so continuing on from the history, then in 65 BC, Pompey of Rome, he conquered Antiochus the eighth, Asiticus, and thus by conquering the king of the north, now pagan Rome became the king of the north and king of the south technically, because both were under their control. And and this will continue until verse 22, as we will see before the next transition begins. And this also explains about the fact that how none stood against Rome and its conquest. I mean, Antiochus the Epiphanes, he was a great king, but for him to bow low and surrender to this new power, it tells us that the Roman Empire was so strong that none stood against the Rome. And verse 16, it also tells us that he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. What is this glorious land? When you go to Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 6, it talks about Palestine, the land of the Israelites, and it was called as the glory of all the lands. So, according to the prophecy, the Romans conquered the glorious land, which at this point represented Palestine. And this was actually true in history because in 161 BC, the Jews and the Romans made an alliance, but in 63 BC, Pompey, he conquered the Jews, thus conquering the glorious land. And it tells us that which by his hand shall be consumed. This talks about the ultimate demolition of the walls of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman Empire. But when Pompey came in 63 BC, he demolished the walls of Jerusalem. He transferred several of the cities from the jurisdiction of Judea to that of Syria, and he even imposed tribute on the Jews, and he also killed thousands of the Jews. And so, just as how the prophecy predicted, all of this was fulfilled. Now, from this point, we will see that Pompey is the king of the north and the successive king of the pagan Roman Empire, and the king of the south at this point, it is still Egypt, but they were allies with Rome. But that was not to be the case for a while, because verse 17 it says, "And he shall also set his face to enter with strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do." This is talking about how the Romans conquered Egypt. Ptolemy the Eulites, he was a king of the south, and he died in 51 BC. And before he died, he placed his two children, Cleopatra and Ptolemy the Seventh, under the guardianship of Rome, and particularly Pompey. But what happened in Rome was that there was this civil war that erupted between Pompey and Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar, he defeats Pompey, and so Pompey, in for safety reasons, he flees to Egypt. But when he gets to Egypt, Ptolemy the Seventh, he kills Pompey, his own guardian, and so Julius Caesar now becomes the guardian for Ptolemy the Seventh and Cleopatra, his sister. Now there was this dispute that arose between Ptolemy the Seventh and Cleopatra, and the party of Ptolemy, his supporters, they wanted to deprive Cleopatra of her power. And at this time, Julius Caesar, he intervenes to settle the matter, but this enrages the Egyptians because they felt that their independence is intruded by this Roman king. But Caesar, he reminds them that the Roman Senate is the guardian for Ptolemy the Seventh and Cleopatra. And so Cleopatra, fearing that she would lose her power, she goes and seduces Julius Caesar and becomes his mistress. And Julius Caesar, who fell in love with Cleopatra, gave this decision that Ptolemy the Seventh and Ptolemy the 12th and Cleopatra, that they should divide and rule. And so as a result, there was this insurrection that takes place. Ptolemy the 12th and his allies, they battle the Roman army. History tells us that the Egyptians, they tried to destroy the Roman fleet in Alexandria's harbor, and Caesar, including its and Caesar responded by burning the Egyptian vessels and causing part of the city to burn, including its library with 400,000 volumes. But it continues that, but an army of the Jews under Antipater, they arrive and they tip the battle in favor of Julius Caesar. The Jews at this point, they sided with the Romans and they helped Julius Caesar win this battle. That is why this verse, it talks about the upright ones stood with this king. And Ptolemy the 12th, he was drowned while he was trying to escape, and the Egyptians submitted to the rulership of Julius Caesar. And the verse, it also tells it, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. The daughter of the women who corrupts here, it represents Cleopatra, and it refers to Cleopatra seducing Julius Caesar and becoming his mistress. And she became pregnant with his child, but the prophecy predicted that she shall not stand, neither be for him. And so Cleopatra, she fights with Rome, with Antony, and turns against Caesar, which was later part of the history. And verse 18 and 19, it says, after this shall he turn his face unto the isles and shall take many. One historian, he writes, in all, Julius Caesar, he won over 500 battles, and he captured 1,000 cities, and he slayed over 1 crore men. You see, he conquests the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so while writing about his conquest to his friend, he writes these three this sentence. He says, I came, I saw, I conquered. That was the conquest of this king Julius Caesar. But it says, but a prince, verse 18, it continues, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease, and without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. This refers to Mark Antony, who represented Julius Caesar while he was away on his political endeavors. It is said that Mark Antony would vote down the actions that the Roman Senate was taking against Julius Caesar. And it is this Mark Antony who is represented here as the prince of this king. And later, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, it was Mark Antony who hunted down his assassins. Verse 19, then he shall turn his face toward the foot of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. You see, after conquering all the cities that were supporting Pompey, Caesar, he returns to his own land, and so he was to be announced as the dictator for life. But as the prophecy says, he stumbled and fell, and he was not found. He was betrayed and assassinated by Brutus, a member of the Roman Senate, in 44 BC. Just like how Alexander the Great died when he was at the height of his power, so also Julius Caesar died when he was at the prime of his life. Verse 20, Daniel chapter 11 and verse 20, it says, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdoms. You see, after the death of Julius Caesar, another one stood up in his place, and this emperor is known as the raiser of taxes. Who is this? If you remember, if you go to Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, history is fascinating and prophecy is even more fascinating. Centuries before this even happened, Bible predicts this exact event. Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, and it says, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. You see, who is this king that Daniel chapter 11 and verse 20 is talking about? It is talking about Caesar Augustus. His original name was Octavius, and he was the nephew of Julius Caesar, whom Julius adopted as a son. And upon the ascension, he took the name Caesar, and later he became known as Caesar Augustus. He initially formed a three-person government with Mark Antony and Lepidus, but by the time he ascended to the throne, they both died. And some historians, they say that Rome reached the pinnacle of its greatness and power during the Augustan age, and it was during his age that Jesus himself was born in Bethlehem of Judea. But verse 20, it tells us that, you see, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of the taxes in the glory of the land, or glory of the kingdom, talking about Caesar Augustus. It says, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. You see, while he was at the height of his power, again he died, but he did not die in a battle, but he peacefully died in his bed. 18 years after he taxed the world, he died in AD 14. Verse 21 and 22. And in his estate shall stand up a wild person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yeah, also the prince of the covenant. So after the death of Caesar Augustus, another person came onto the scene, and this person was Tiberius Caesar. These two verses talks about Tiberius Caesar. He was the stepson of Augustus, and he reigned from AD 14 to AD 34, but he co-ruled with Augustus from AD 12. And if you remember, it was at the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar that Jesus was baptized. And so Bible describes him as this wild person, and history shows it too. Uriah Smith, one commentator, he writes this about this king Tiberius Caesar. He says Tiberius Caesar follows Augustus on the Roman throne. He was raised to the consulate at the age of 29. It is recorded that as Augustus was about to nominate his successor, his wife Livia besought him to nominate Tiberius, her son, by a former husband. But the emperor said, your son is too wild to wear the purple of Rome. Instead, the nomination was given to Agrippa, a virtuous and a much respected Roman citizen. But the prophecy had foreseen that a wild person should succeed Augustus. Agrippa died, and Augustus was again under the necessity of choosing a successor. And so Livia, he renewed her intercession for Tiberius, and Augustus, weakened by age and sickness, was more easily flattered, and finally he consented to nominate this young man as his colleague and successor. But the citizens, they never gave him the love, respect, and honor the kingdom due to an upright and a faithful sovereign. And in fact, this is what he writes: tyranny, hypocrisy, and debauchery, and uninterrupted intoxication. If these traits and practices show a man to be wild, Tiberius exhibited that character to perfection. Thus we say how this prophecy was fulfilled exactly. But this verse, it also tells what's something else that will be broken. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 2, 12. But with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yeah, also the prince of the covenant. You see, who was this prince of the covenant? Who was this prince of the covenant? We see in Daniel chapter 9 that it refers to Jesus. Jesus was the prince of the covenant. In Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25, it calls the Messiah as the prince. And verse 27 of Daniel 9 tells us that the Messiah, the prince, will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And so it was during the reign of Tiberius Caesar when Jesus was crucified. After Jesus died, 6 years later, Tiberius dies. Thus, the prophecy was again fulfilled exactly as predicted in the Bible. So far, what we have seen is we have gone from verses 11, verses 1 through 22, and we have looked at the history. We compared the prophecy with history. But at this point, I want to focus on this word covenant. It says, this time even the prince of the covenant, he shall be broken. Although one may think it is not important, as we try to understand this prophecy, understanding of what the covenant is and what happened to it is very, very vital for us to understand the rest of this prophecy. It gives us this hermeneutical tool, an interpretive tool to guide us in understanding the rest of the prophecy. You see, all the while, we were looking at this prophecy. We looked at the kings of the Medes and the Persians. We looked at the kings of Grecia. We looked at the Caesars and the Augustus and all the wars. We looked at the king of the north. We looked at king of the south. Why does this all matter? Why would God predict all of this? Friends, we need to understand the purpose or the reason of why God told Gabriel to tell Daniel this prophecy. We read in Daniel 10:14. We read it at the beginning, but we will read it again. It says, "Now I am come to show thee," that is Daniel, "understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days." The purpose of this chapter was because Gabriel wanted Daniel to know what is going to happen to his people. Who are Daniel's people? The Jews. But it was not only them, it also talks about the Christian church. It also talks about you and me. God revealed all of these political events ahead of time for the sole reason to inform his people what will happen to inform what will happen to his people. And so when this chapter talks about the king of the north, the king of the south, it is all in relation to Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God. This whole chapter, Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 22, it revolves around Jerusalem and God's people and who are going to rule over them and all of them. But up until this point, this chapter has been focusing on little Jews. It was focusing on the land of Palestine. Why? Why is it so? It is because God made this covenant with Abraham, their forefather, that through his seed, all the nations will be blessed. God made a covenant with Abraham. And so, according to this covenant, Jesus will come. Jesus, the Messiah, will come down in their lineage, and it was predicted by various prophets. In fact, Bible calls him the desire of all nations. But part of the covenant was that the Jews were to show forth their praises to the true God of heaven, to those around them, and to prepare them for the arrival of the Messiah as he comes to set up the kingdom of grace. God made this covenant. God told Abraham, the Messiah will come in your lineage, but you have the duty. You have to go and prepare the people, the nations, the heathens, to receive the Messiah. But these covenant people, they were given to idolatry and they disobeyed the commandments of God, which was the very basis of the covenant. God sends prophets after prophets with messages. They did not listen. He sends them to Babylon. They did not listen. He graciously sends them back to their place, hoping they'll learn a lesson or few, and return back to keep the commandment. But they did not listen. That is why in Daniel chapter 9, God gives this 490 years of probationary time to this people. God was going to give to this people, and he tells them that, I have given you this time, and at the end of this time, your probation will be closed. This was a time that they had to get ready. And so God foretold that he will send the Messiah himself to come and confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. But sadly, we know from history that they did not prepare the heathens for the coming of Jesus, nor did they prepare themselves to receive the Messiah. Not only so, they rejected and they even crucified Jesus. John tells us that Jesus came unto his own, but they received him not. Jesus came to his people. They received him. They rejected him. They broke the covenant. They rejected and they crucified Jesus. During his earthly ministry, Jesus, through many parables, he called the people to come and to repent and to come into this covenant relationship. But they crucified, and they even said, "His blood be upon us." And they said, "We have no king But Caesar, even though God still graciously sent the disciples to preach after Jesus resurrected, but they stoned Stephen, the final prophet. And as a result, this special relationship that these people had with God was broken. The God with the special relationship that God had with the Jewish nation was broken, and it was extended to all people. That's why you see in the book of Acts Paul going and preaching the gospel to the multitudes and to the Gentiles, and he baptized and he calls people to accept Christ. And the requirement was not for them to become a Jew, but they were to become Christians. That is why in the very next verses, John chapter 1 and verses 12 and 13, this was probably the last book that was written in the New Testament. He's talking about this new fresh relationship between God and his people. Verse 11, he says, he came unto his own, but his own received him not. But verse 12 says, but as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. You see, one does not have to be born of the blood to be the sons of God. One does not have to be born in the lineage of Abraham to be sons of God. Whoever receives Jesus by faith, they become the sons of God. This was the new covenant. Galatians 3 and verse 29. Paul is writing and he says, if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. If you are Christ, if you receive Christ, you are Abraham's seed, you became a heir. There are more verses in the New Testament that talk about this wonderful truth, but I just want to look at a couple more passages before we wrap up today's presentation. If you go to Exodus chapter 19, Exodus chapter 19, God leads his people out of Egypt, and he brings them to the foothills of Mount Sinai, and he makes a covenant with the people. God makes a covenant with this people. And listen to verse 5 and 6. Verse 5 and 6, it says, now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar people unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. God is using Moses as his mediator, and he tells Moses that if this people obey my commandments, if they keep my commandments, if they keep my covenant, they will become a peculiar treasure to me above all people, and that you will become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation to me. This was what God wanted to do with the nation of Israel. But as we saw just now, they broke this covenant. They disobeyed God's commandments, and they even rejected the Messiah. So what happens? What happens? Let's go to Second Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. Second Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. There's this beautiful verse that we are all familiar with, but we do not understand the significance of it as much as we should. First Peter chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So Peter is writing to the strangers. Who are these strangers? He is writing to the non-Jews. He begins this letter by saying that he's writing to the strangers because they were not Jews. But listen to this verse that he writes in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. He writes to these people, it says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Verse 10, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. This is very, very revolutionary to those people who are living at those time. He's writing to the strangers and not Jews, and he says, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a peculiar people, and that God has called them to show forth his praises." And in verse 10, he says, "In times where you were not a people, but now you are the people of God." Now, is this terminology familiar with you? You see, we read in Exodus 19 where God calls the nation of Israel as a peculiar people, as a chosen generation, as a kingdom of priests, as a holy nation. Now, because those people fell away from the covenant, because they rejected the Messiah and rejected to be part of the covenant, God extends this covenant to all the people. And so now he calls the Gentiles, everyone who accepts him, as a chosen nation, as a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a peculiar people. This relation that God wanted to have with the Israelites, which they rejected, now he wants to have it with you and me. So when this verse in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 12, it talks about the prince of the covenant being was broken. It it talks about this transition after the death of Jesus and after the stoning of Stephen. There is a transition that took place in how God was relating to the people. The Jewish nation lost their significance as a chosen people of God. Now anyone who has faith are the chosen people of God. We become spiritual Israelites. All the covenant blessings that was not fulfilled in with the literal Israelites because of their disobedience will be given to those spiritual Israelites who are obedient. And all the kings that we have seen so far are the kings who, and so all the kings that we saw in Daniel 11, they were the kings who were at their time in charge of Palestine. But this is not some secular history, this is sacred history. God was showing to Daniel that all the nations, all the kings who would take charge of Palestine. But now what happens in the rest of the chapter is this: it is different. This is no more talking about the literal king of the north, it is no more talking about the literal king of the south, it is no more talking about the literal glorious land. After verses 22 onwards, this is talking about this new this there is this new form of prophecy that we will see. And this is where the hermeneutical tool um, that we are going to look at is going to take place, and that is what we will be doing tomorrow. You see, the prerogatives and the benefits of literal Israel is now transferred to spiritual Israel. The local Middle Eastern powers and the lands that we saw from verses 1 through 22, like Egypt and Rome, they are not going to be literal anymore. They are going to be antitypical and spiritual. Everything that was local and literal, now it becomes spiritual and universal. The glorious land, it doesn't refers to Palestine anymore. The king of the south, in the rest of this chapter, it doesn't refer to Egypt as a nation anymore, because before, the king of the north and the king of the south were geographical terms that were used to point to specific nations referenced by Jerusalem. But after the crucifixion of Jesus and Stephen's death, they are no longer limited to Middle East geography. And it is very, very important that we understand this. Friends, it is very, very important, because the majority of the evangelical world, they do not understand this transition of the covenant. And because of this, many of them are looking to literal Jerusalem, where they're looking for Christ to come and reign, where they're looking for the Antichrist to come and to rule. But we will cover all of this tomorrow. But the Bible calls us to rightly divide the word of truth. And so as we do, we will not be deceived by the deceptions of Satan. And if you're wondering if God cares about you, in spite of all of this, he still does. That is why he has revealed this prophecy for you and me, so we can be ready when he comes and not be deceived. I'm looking forward to tomorrow, where we are going to look from verses 23 onwards till verse 45, and try to see the role that we play in this great battle between God and Satan. May God bless you.